It was a cold October evening when the knock came at my door. I had just settled into my favorite armchair, a steaming cup of chamomile tea in hand, and the faint scent of burning wood from the fireplace filling the room. My name is Marigold Ashcroft, and for the last 5 years, I've lived alone in this old Victorian house nestled on the outskirts of Maplewood, Vermont. It's quiet here, too quiet sometimes, but it suits me. Or so I thought until he showed up. When I opened the door, there he stood, a young man not much older than 30 with tousled brown hair and eyes that seemed too sharp for his boyish face. He wore a leather jacket and carried an air of unease, like someone who didn't quite belong. "Mrs. Ashcroft?" he asked, his voice hesitant but firm. I nodded, gripping the doorknob tighter. Something about him made my stomach twist. Then he said the words that would shatter my world. "My name is Ezra Callahan. Your late husband, he was my father." I stared at him, dumbfounded, as if waiting for the punchline to some cruel joke. But Ezra didn't laugh. Instead, he pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to me. "This is why I'm here," he said simply. The letter bore Reginald's handwriting. I'd know those looping cursive letters anywhere. As I scanned the lines, my hands trembled. In it, Reginald admitted to having a son outside our marriage, a child he regretted abandoning but could never bring himself to acknowledge publicly. The room spun around me. How could Reginald keep something like this from me? We were married for 40 years. 40 years of shared meals, whispered secrets, and dreams built together. All of it now felt tainted. I looked up at Ezra, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "You expect me to believe this?" I snapped. "That you're some long-lost heir come to claim what isn't yours?" Ezra met my gaze steadily. "I don't want to hurt you, Mrs. Ashcroft. I just want what's fair." His calmness infuriated me even more. Who did he think he was, barging into my life after all these years? After Ezra left, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Reginald's face smiling back at me. Not the loving husband I remembered, but a stranger hiding behind a mask. By morning I decided I needed answers. I drove into town to visit Mr. Hargrove, the lawyer who handled Reginald's estate. He greeted me warmly, but his smile faded when I mentioned Ezra. "There is a trust fund," he admitted reluctantly, "set aside for someone named E.C." My heart sank. Why hadn't Reginald told me? Was this why he always insisted on keeping certain documents locked away in his study? I returned home determined to uncover the truth. That night, I rummaged through Reginald's desk and found an old photo tucked inside a dusty envelope. It showed him standing beside a young woman holding a baby. The resemblance between the infant and Ezra undeniable. My knees buckled as I sank onto the floor. For the first time, doubt crept into my mind. Could Ezra really be telling the truth? Word travels fast in small towns like Maplewood. Within days, everyone knew about Ezra's arrival and his claim. At the grocery store, neighbors whispered behind their carts. At church, women exchanged knowing glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Even Betty, my closest friend, called to ask if the rumors were true. "Marigold, is that poor boy really Reginald's son?" she asked softly. Poor boy. The phrase stung. Ezra, meanwhile, rented a tiny apartment above the bakery downtown. He started showing up places I frequented. The library, the farmer's market, the park where Reginald and I used to walk. Each sighting felt like a deliberate intrusion, a reminder of the chaos he'd brought into my life. One afternoon, I spotted him sitting on a bench near the river, sketching in a notebook. When he noticed me watching, he waved awkwardly. I turned away quickly, my cheeks burning. What right did he have to act so casual, as if he belonged here? Enough was enough. I marched over to Ezra's apartment one rainy evening, my umbrella dripping puddles onto his worn carpet. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded before he could even close the door. "Why won't you leave me alone?" Ezra sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "Because I deserve answers," he said. "And maybe you do too." His words struck a nerve. "Answers?" I spat. "You think breaking into my life and dragging up the past will give us answers? You're nothing but a liar." Ezra flinched but held his ground. "If I'm lying, then prove it," he shot back. "But deep down you know I'm not. You've seen the letter. You've seen the picture. Stop pretending you don't care." His accusation hit too close to home. I stormed out, slamming the door behind me, but his words echoed in my ears long after I got home. The tension reached its peak during the annual Harvest Festival. Ezra attended, much to my dismay, and set up a booth selling handmade crafts to earn some money. When I arrived, people flocked to him, curious about the long-lost son of the late Reginald Ashcroft. Watching them laugh and chat with him made bile rise in my throat. How dare they accept him so easily while treating me like the villain? I approached his booth under the pretense of browsing. "Enjoying your newfound fame?" I sneered, loud enough for nearby listeners to hear. Ezra straightened, his jaw tightening. "I'm not here for fame, Mrs. Ashcroft. I'm here because I have nowhere else to go." His vulnerability caught me off guard, but I refused to let it soften me. "Well, you should have stayed wherever you came from," I hissed. "You're ruining everything." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, surrounded by silence. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes I saw Ezra's face, hurt, defiant, and somehow still hopeful. It infuriated me. How could he stand there acting like the victim? He didn't know what it was like to lose Reginald, to feel the weight of a life built together crumbling into dust. And yet here he was trying to take what little I had left. By morning I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to let him win, not without a fight. I hired a private investigator named Mr. Grayson, a wiry man with a cigarette-stained voice who specialized in digging up dirt. "Find out everything you can about this Ezra Callahan," I told him. "I want proof that he's lying." Mr. Grayson nodded, jotting notes in his worn leather notebook. "You'll have your answers soon enough," he promised. As I watched him leave, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. If Ezra thought he could walk into my life and destroy it, he was wrong. A week later, Mr. Grayson returned with a thick file folder. "He's clean," he admitted reluctantly, flipping through the pages. "No criminal record, no history of fraud. Everything checks out. He really is who he says he is." My stomach dropped. But then, buried deep in the report, I found something useful. Ezra had once been arrested during a protest years ago. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The next day, I anonymously called the local newspaper, feeding them a fabricated story about how Ezra was extorting money from vulnerable widows under false pretenses. Within hours, the article went live online, painting him as a manipulative con artist. The backlash was immediate. People stopped visiting his booth at the market. Shopkeepers refused to serve him. Even Betty called again, her tone colder this time. "Marigold, is any of this true?" she asked. I feigned ignorance. "I wouldn't know," I lied. "But if it were me, I'd be careful." Ezra confronted me outside the post office 2 days later. His eyes were bloodshot, his usual confidence replaced by desperation. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Why are people treating me like this?" I crossed my arms, forcing myself to stay calm. "Maybe because they finally see you for who you are," I said coldly. "A liar and a thief." For a moment he just stared at me, disbelief etched across his face. Then quietly he said, "You don't understand, do you? I'm not doing this for money. I wanted to know where I came from. To feel like I belonged somewhere." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I refused to show weakness. "Well, you picked the wrong place," I snapped. "Now get out of my town." He didn't argue. Instead he turned and walked away, shoulders slumped. Watching him go, I felt a strange mix of triumph and unease. Ezra left Maplewood a few days later. At first I tried to convince myself it was for the best, that I'd protected my home and my legacy. But the victory felt hollow. Everywhere I went, people avoided meeting my gaze or whispered behind their hands. Even the Harvest Festival, usually a joyous occasion, felt muted without Ezra's presence. One evening I found myself standing in front of the mirror, staring at the woman reflected back at me. Her silver hair was neatly combed, her blouse pressed to perfection, but her eyes looked tired, almost haunted. Who was I becoming? Was this really worth it? That night I dreamt of Reginald. He stood on the edge of a riverbank calling out to me. When I reached for him, he vanished, leaving only ripples in the water. I woke up gasping, tears streaming down my face. For the first time I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Days turned into weeks, and Ezra's absence loomed over Maplewood like a shadow I couldn't shake. At first, the town seemed to breathe easier without him. Life returned to its quiet rhythm, and the whispers about me slowly faded. Yet instead of relief, I felt emptiness. My mornings were spent staring out the kitchen window at the garden Reginald and I had planted together, now overgrown with weeds. Even my favorite armchair felt colder somehow, as if it no longer belonged to me. I began avoiding social gatherings altogether. Betty stopped inviting me to her weekly card games, likely sensing that something was wrong. "You've changed, Marigold," she said one afternoon when I ran into her at the library. Her words stung because they were true. I had changed, not just since Ezra arrived but perhaps long before that. I mumbled an excuse and hurried away, unable to face the pity in her eyes. One rainy Tuesday I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, only my name scrawled across the brown paper in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside I found a stack of old letters tied with a fraying ribbon. They were addressed to someone named Clara, the waitress Reginald had briefly dated decades ago. Each letter was filled with regret, longing, and love, for both Clara and me. In one particularly poignant passage Reginald wrote, "I wish I could undo the pain I've caused you both, but I can't. All I can do is hope that someday you'll forgive me." My hands trembled as I read those words. For years I'd clung to the image of Reginald as my devoted husband, but these letters revealed a man far more complicated and human than I'd ever allowed myself to see. By the time I finished reading, tears blurred my vision. Maybe Ezra wasn't the only one searching for truth. Maybe I'd been running from it too. Despite the guilt gnawing at me, I refused to reach out to Ezra. Pride or fear kept me rooted in place. Instead, I threw myself into charity work, organizing food drives and volunteering at the local shelter. It was easy to lose myself in helping others, pretending their problems were bigger than mine. But late at night, when the house was silent and the darkness pressed against the windows, I couldn't escape the memories. Then came the phone call. A woman claiming to be Clara Callahan, Ezra's mother, left a message on my answering machine. "Ezra's sick," she said, her voice trembling. "He's been struggling since he left Maplewood. Please, if there's anything you can do." The message ended abruptly, leaving me frozen in shock. Sick? Struggling? I replayed the recording several times, each word sinking deeper into my conscience. This was my fault. If I hadn't driven him away, maybe he wouldn't be suffering now. Still, I didn't pick up the phone to call her back. What would I even say? The next morning, I visited Father O'Malley, the priest at St. Mary's Church. He listened patiently as I poured out my confession, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "Marigold," he said gently, "forgiveness isn't always about fixing what's broken. Sometimes it's about letting go of the anger that binds us." His words lingered in my mind as I walked home, the autumn leaves crunching beneath my feet. That evening I sat down with pen and paper, writing letters I knew I'd never send, to Reginald, to Ezra, and to Clara. In them I poured out all the emotions I'd buried for so long. My grief, my anger, my guilt. Writing them felt cathartic, like releasing a heavy weight I'd carried for years. Yet as I sealed the envelopes and tucked them away in a drawer, I knew it wasn't enough. Forgiveness might begin with words, but it required action too. A few days later, another letter arrived, this time from Clara herself. She informed me that Ezra had passed away. His illness had worsened after leaving Maplewood, and despite her efforts to care for him, he succumbed to pneumonia. Reading her words, I felt as though the floor had dropped out from under me. Ezra was gone and there was nothing I could do to make amends. I spent the rest of the day wandering aimlessly around the house, clutching the letter in trembling hands. Memories of our encounters flooded back. The way he'd looked at me with such earnestness, the pain in his voice when I accused him of lying. I realized then how much I'd underestimated him, dismissing him as a threat rather than seeing him as a person. By the time night fell, exhaustion overwhelmed me and I collapsed onto the couch, clutching a blanket tightly around me. Sleep eluded me, haunted by visions of Ezra standing on the riverbank where I'd last seen Reginald in my dreams. The following week I attended Ezra's funeral. It was a small gathering held in a modest church outside Burlington. Only a handful of people were there: Clara, a few distant relatives, and a young boy who sat quietly beside her. As I approached Clara after the service, she offered me a sad smile. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "Ezra spoke highly of you even after everything." Her words pierced through me like a knife. High praise from a man I'd treated so cruelly, it was almost unbearable. Before I could respond, the boy tugged on Clara's sleeve. "Who's that?" he whispered, pointing at me. Clara hesitated, then introduced him as Thomas, Ezra's son. Shock rippled through me. Ezra had a child. A piece of him still alive in this world. As I knelt down to meet Thomas's curious gaze, I saw echoes of Reginald in his features. For the first time in months I felt something other than regret. A flicker of hope. After the funeral I couldn't bring myself to leave Thomas and Clara behind. Something about the boy's quiet demeanor, his cautious curiosity, reminded me too much of Ezra, and it stirred emotions I'd buried deep within me. When Clara invited me back to her modest apartment for tea, I accepted, though every step felt like walking through quicksand. The walls were adorned with photographs of Ezra at various stages of his life, as a toddler clutching a stuffed bear, as a teenager with a guitar slung over his shoulder, and finally as the man I'd come to know, a stranger who wasn't so strange anymore. Thomas sat quietly on the couch, flipping through a picture book while Clara and I spoke in hushed tones. She told me about Ezra's struggles growing up without a father figure, how he'd always dreamed of finding the family he never knew. He wanted to understand where he came from, she said, her voice breaking. Not for money or revenge but for closure. Her words cut deeper than any blade. How could I have misjudged him so completely? As we talked, Thomas wandered over and handed me one of the photos from the wall. It was a candid shot of Ezra laughing, sunlight streaming across his face. "That's Daddy," he said simply. My throat tightened but I managed a small smile. "Yes," I replied. "That's your daddy." Over the next few weeks I found myself visiting Clara and Thomas more often. At first it was out of guilt, an attempt to make amends for what I'd done, but soon it became something else entirely. Thomas had a way of drawing people in, his innocence and resilience shining through despite the loss he'd endured. He reminded me of Reginald in ways that both comforted and unsettled me. The tilt of his head when he was thinking, the way his laughter filled a room, even the stubborn set of his jaw when he didn't get his way. One afternoon as we sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas asked me about Reginald. "Was he nice?" he said, swinging his legs back and forth. The question caught me off guard. For years I'd shielded myself from thinking too deeply about Reginald's flaws, clinging to the idealized version of him I'd built in my mind. But looking into Thomas's wide, earnest eyes, I realized I owed him the truth. He was complicated, I admitted. Sometimes he made mistakes just like everyone else. But he loved deeply and fiercely. Thomas nodded solemnly as if processing my words. In that moment I saw not just Reginald's legacy, but also the opportunity to shape it anew. Despite the growing bond with Thomas, I couldn't escape the weight of my actions. Each visit left me torn between joy and sorrow, connection and regret. Back home, the silence of my house pressed down on me harder than ever. I stopped attending church, stopped answering Betty's calls, stopped pretending everything was fine. Instead, I spent hours sitting by the window, staring at the garden I hadn't tended in months. The roses Reginald had planted were wilting, their petals brown and brittle. Like me, they were dying a slow death. At night, I dreamt of Ezra again, not as the angry young man I'd fought with, but as the boy in those photographs, full of hope and wonder. In my dreams, he stood beside Reginald on the riverbank, both of them calling out to me. When I reached for them, they vanished, leaving only ripples in the water. I woke each morning feeling more hollow than the day before. Was this my punishment? To be haunted by the ghosts of those I'd wronged, unable to find peace? Desperate for some form of release, I began writing letters again, this time intending to send them. To Clara, I poured out my apologies, explaining how fear and pride had blinded me to Ezra's humanity. To Thomas, I wrote promises I hoped to keep, that I would be there for him no matter what. And to Reginald, I confessed everything. The anger, the betrayal, the guilt, it all spilled onto the page in jagged handwriting. But the hardest letter was the one I wrote to Ezra. "I'm sorry," I began, "for doubting you, for hurting you, for letting my own pain blind me to yours. You deserved better than what I gave you." By the time I finished, tears soaked the paper, smudging the ink. I folded the letters carefully and sealed them in envelopes, knowing they might never reach their intended recipients. Still, writing them felt like a start, a tentative step toward redemption. The day I mailed the letters, I decided to sell the house. It no longer felt like mine. Its walls held too many memories, too many secrets. I moved into a small apartment downtown, closer to Clara and Thomas. Though the change was daunting, It felt necessary, as if shedding the past was the only way to move forward. Clara welcomed me with open arms, introducing me to Thomas as Grandma Marigold. At first, the title felt foreign, almost absurd. But as Thomas wrapped his tiny arms around me and whispered, "You're part of our family now," something inside me softened. Maybe forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of others' wrongs. It was also about forgiving yourself. Yet even as I embraced this new chapter, shadows lingered. Late at night, when the world was still, I sometimes heard footsteps in the hallway or saw flashes of Reginald's face in the mirror. Were they real or figments of my imagination? Either way, they served as reminders. The past could never truly be erased. It was up to me to decide whether it defined me, or freed me. One crisp December morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of legal documents spread before me. It was time to update my will, a task I'd been avoiding for years. As I flipped through the pages, Thomas's face kept appearing in my mind. He was too young to understand inheritance or legacies, but I knew one thing for certain. He deserved a future free from the struggles Ezra had endured. With trembling hands, I wrote out my final wishes. The house, the savings, the heirlooms, all of it would go to Thomas. I included a letter to be read when he came of age, explaining who I was and why I'd chosen to leave him everything. "You are your father's son," I wrote, "but you're also your own person. Use this gift not to dwell on the past but to build a brighter tomorrow." Signing the document felt like closing a chapter, not just of my life but of Reginald's and Ezra's as well. As I sealed the envelope, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. Had I done enough to make amends? Could any amount of money truly compensate for the pain I'd caused? The questions swirled in my mind, unanswered. But for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of peace. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about creating something meaningful from the wreckage. The holidays passed quietly that year. Clara invited me to spend Christmas Eve with her and Thomas, and though I hesitated at first, I accepted. Sitting by their modest tree,